Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Welcome back. I'm super happy today to be talking to Megan McArdle. Megan is a journalist for the Washington Post, where she writes a column about economics, finance, and government policy. She used to work at a very popular blog called Asymmetrical Information under the pseudonym Jane Galt. I always pronounce that wrong. A reference to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. She makes absolutely the best desserts, if you were wondering. Today, we're going to be talking about a book she wrote a while ago. I was too young to read it at the time. I don't think I could read. It's called The Upside of Down. So welcome, Megan.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump in, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
You think you have it figured out. You don't have it figured out. You never will entirely have it figured out. And that's okay, because as things go along, you'll figure it out.
Sounds good. It's actually kind of interesting. I know that I don't have it figured out, but I keep thinking there's going to be a day at some point.
Nope.
And then people keep being like, "No, we're adults. We don't know what we're doing still." And I'm like, "What?"
You get a lot of things figured out. Like when I think about going back to high school, I would not for a million years go back, because I do have some things figured out about, I hate to do the like at your age, but okay, at your age, certainly I and everyone I knew. You kids may be different with your Venmo and your like hip hoppity pants and whatever. But at that age, we were trying on who we might want to be. We tried on a lot of different personalities. We tried on different looks. We tried on all of that stuff. And by my 40s, I kind of know who I am and who I'm not. I know that I am never going to be a particular kind of person that I think I very much wanted to be at 16. A sort of easy, chipper community person who just, fits right into any group. I'm more of a specialty product. I've come to like aspects of that but also just accept it rather than kind of trying different ways to become a person I just wasn't. So I think in that way you do get stuff figured out. And there's something bittersweet about that, because you get into your 40s and 50s and you sort of realize, like, this is who I am and I'm never going to be anyone else. I'm not going to be like a third baseman for the New York Yankees. I'm not going to do any of these other things. I'm not. And then you get to a point where you're not only like, this is who I am and what I'm going to do, but this is who I am and what I have done. And there's less time ahead of you than behind. So that's, that part is a little bit, you miss the old feeling of endless possibilities, but there is something nice at realizing which possibilities aren't going to work. But I still remember when I was on my 30th birthday, and there's a bit of this in the book. I don't think I put this particular incident in. It's now been so many years since I wrote it that I don't know every line anymore. But I was panicking because I'd been unemployed for years. I'd finally gotten a job. It paid $40,000 a year, which was a third less than I'd been making before I went to business school, which had preceded my 2 years of unemployment. And I was living in New York City. I had $100,000 worth of student loans, and I was panicking because that was a really tight budget. I mean, it was a really tight budget. I used to joke that I lived on ramen and cheese doodle surprise, where the surprise is that you're 30 years old and still eating ramen and cheese doodles for dinner because you can't afford anything else. My mom took me out to a quite nice dinner And my parents had been very supportive. They'd let me live at home while I was getting back on my feet and so forth. But they were also kind of like the farmers. They're like, okay, you have a job now, time to move. It wasn't like you can now stay here for several years or. And so I moved out and I'm kind of panicking. My mom took me to a nice dinner and we're sitting there and she looked across the table at some point. I'm trying to like be cool, despite the fact that I'm basically in a nonstop panic over how I'm going to pay rent. Cause my budget had like my entire disposable income for things like food and transportation and so forth was in the low hundreds of dollars a month. And that was very tight. Um, and she just looked across the table at me and she said, I sense that you're panicking. I was like, why, yes, mother, I am in fact panicking. And she said, you know what? When I had you, I was 27 years old. We just bought the apartment that I grew up in. Um, and, we had less than $500 in the bank and I was 8 months pregnant and I just quit my job. She said, you'll figure it out. And it was a little bit reassuring that she said that, right? That she understood that like I was frightened and that things were a little bit scary and that they were in fact a little bit scary. And she was like, it's okay. You are the sort of person who will figure this out. And that the other reassuring thing was actually learning over the years that I did figure it out, fitfully and different, but I always figured out how to survive. And but also I discovered stuff along the way that I just hadn't expected. I never expected to become a journalist. This was not in any way part of my life plan. I kind of stumbled into it, but I love it. And a lot of the things that just weren't part of my life plan have turned out to be great. And my life is very different from what I thought it would be at 16 or 21 or 30. But I wouldn't trade much of it. Some of it. To every life, a little rain must fall. But and it's not like I'm sort of some uniquely special person who's had this incredibly blessed life. There's stuff I didn't get to do that I wanted to. There's stuff that I did that I probably would rather not have. But overall, I look at all of my friends, I look at all of the people I know, and like, no one got everything they wanted, but everyone got something they wanted real bad. And like, it's better than it sounds at 16 or 17.
That actually makes me pretty optimistic. It's weird because I hear that sort of thing a lot where, oh, your life is not going to turn out the way you expect it. The plan is not going to happen exactly as you wrote it down in your diary when you were like 12. And I did not do that, but I had a general life plan. Like my sister wanted to be president. She's changed her mind about that. But
Wise.
everyone has a plan at some point. And I feel like at this point, I know I'm not going to have a plan entirely. So I don't know what to expect because I don't have a plan, but I also don't not have a plan. It's this weird gray area for me. Anyways, let's talk about the book, which kind of follows along the line of your response to that question.
Yes.
It came out a while ago. Yep. I read it recently.
Yep.
My excuse is that I was very, very
I think
young.
You were like 5 when it came out. So it came out no, actually that's not right. You're maybe 9. It came out in 2014. So, which is 7 years ago, which is terrifying.
So I was 11, I think.
You're 11. Okay.
Yeah. So
I graduated from high school a year early. I'm a January baby. And so I always like look back. I always work from my own birthday in my senior year and not other people's birthdays.
The struggle. So I don't know, with the podcast and with being a senior, going through the college application process and all of the struggles that come with that, and also just learning about innovation, entrepreneurs, and different parts of the economy, I kind of started to realize how big a role failure plays in life. And most of my guests seem to think that failure is not just a part of life, but it's also a productive part of life. So I thought it was time to read your book, which I did. I'm glad I did. This book is very personal, but it's also instructive and applicable to your own life. Well, I mean, your being whoever is reading it.
Yes,
Um,
I hope
so
so.
can you tell us why you decided to write a book about failure, especially one that's so personal? Because often when you read a book about failure or something along the lines of success, or you need failure to succeed, it's not personal. It's more like, oh, business, business, business.
Yeah, and I think that that's a real problem. Is that, we talk about failure in the abstract being great, right? And they talk about, the kind of Silicon Valley attitude, which is much admired abroad and is great, of having a failure as a positive for your resume. We don't talk enough about the like really sucky failures and the fact that failure feels really bad. It's not that, I just cheerfully am like, maybe I will suck at this and fail. Like, yay. I in theory would like to have that attitude, but in fact, it feels terrible when you've made a spectacular mess of something, which is just kind of part of doing something you know how to do. Is you might make a spectacular mess of it, and in some ways that just doesn't matter, right? Whether when you're doing low stakes stuff, you're trying a new hobby or something, like great, maybe you just made a spectacular mess of something, and it was super fun making the spectacular mess. And eventually you kind of figure out things, as I like to say when people tell me their baking woes, because I do write about food, hence the dessert reference, is I say, like, it's good. To really make a good pie or a cake, you've got to learn like 1,000 ways to not make a good pie or a cake. And it really is just in a funny way, it's just, especially with pastry, but also even with cakes, is like it's this tactile thing that you cannot really just acquire from a book or even a YouTube video. You acquire it by like looking in your oven and saying, that does not look right to me. That is not the cake of my dreams. And then just trying different stuff until you get, and with feedback and so forth, to get closer to the cake of your dreams. And so I wanted to talk about some of the personal stuff that doesn't make it in there, right? Like the business writers who write about failure, it tends to all be at like 30,000 feet, or they relate some really amusing little failure or something. They don't relate just the way that, they catastrophically screwed up their first marriage, or that they, like me, spent 2 years kind of in employment limbo because I couldn't figure out how to get a new job, which actually turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me. And this is so funny. I actually did Google this, and people had told me this, and it really was true. And it's less true now, because now, when I wrote the book, Google's algorithm was not nearly as specialized as it is now, where like it really knows what you want. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not sure this experiment still works. But when you would Google the best thing that ever happened to me in 2010, when I started writing this, it was like crazy the answers you would get. It was like going to prison, or, like, um, becoming paralyzed, or like all of these things. And people, they're not lying. And that's that's the other crazy thing, is that it really did change them, and they might regret the thing that led up to it, but it opened some door, where there's this kind of cheesy line from The Sound of Music, which I've always actually loved, which is, God never closes a door without opening a window. And I don't want to sound like Pollyanna, like everything is a bright side, but in fact, your failures going through the suck changes you in ways that often make it possible. The very least, you've learned something that didn't work, and if you will fearlessly look at your mistakes, you have learned how to be better in the future. Every failure contains some message about how to be better in the future, if you're willing to look for it, which is often really uncomfortable, because often the thing is like, you did something embarrassing, you did something that you really wish you hadn't, you were responsible for your own. But it also often changes your circumstances in ways that can actually be very freeing. And that's one of the examples that I wrote about in the book, without in any way minimizing the incredible psychological pain of being unemployed for 2 years. I sort of had jobs, but I just gotten out of business school. I was supposed to have like an awesome high flying professional career, and I definitely did not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that it was miserable, and I still remember like the naughtier of it. Two incidents that I'll relate quickly. One was that I was dating this guy who's in private equity and had a lot more money than me, because I didn't have any, and so he was paying for all our dates. And he was like, oh, I got us tickets for this show. I don't really know anything about it. I just heard about it. It's off Broadway. It's closing. It's going to Broadway. but it involves puppets. So it turned out it was Avenue Q, which is about it's about a bunch of loser puppets in like the mythical Avenue Q in New York, which is where you go if you like leave Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C. It was kind of a New York in joke that doesn't even work anymore because the Lower East Side is not cheap. But anyway, so it's about loser puppets, and I'm sitting in this theater and I'm like, oh my god, he's sending me a message. This sounds crazy, right? This sounds totally. It was, in fact, people later when I would tell the story, I think I told the story to him, and he was like, "Are you crazy?" And I was like, "Yes, yes, I was crazy. I had been unemployed for almost 2 years at this point. I was crazy." Um, but I'm sitting there like, he's sending me a message that I am the loser, because the loser puppets, at least some of them had jobs. I mean, there might be terrible jobs, but they had jobs. I did not. I was like, this is a message that he's tired of taking me. It was totally crazy. But I remember just like writhing in agony in this theater for 2 hours, and finally just kind of bursting out into the night and just wanting to cry. I did not cry, but the other anecdote was that I went to a happy hour for people I'd gone to business school with. And, everyone's like, they're having babies or getting married. They've got a new job. And then there's me who's like, I am consulting, which is what you said when you didn't have a job. And I couldn't afford a drink. So I'm nursing a glass of water and I'm kind of circulating and talking to people. And it was good to see people. But but it was also really stressful because I didn't have anything good to say. I had the embarrassment of like, I'm living at home with my parents, which is exactly as humiliating as it sounds at the age of 30. And I'm consulting. And so this guy I didn't know very well came up to me and he said, "Hi, Megan, how are you doing?" And I just kind of snapped and I just looked at him and I said, "I am perilously close to despair."
Oof.
And he just looked at me and he sort of sidled away like he was afraid to turn his back on me. He was like, "I'm sorry." I think he said something like, "I'm sorry to hear that." Right. And then it was actually just a few weeks later, I was the master of almost getting jobs. I almost got so many jobs. Like I got into the State Department and then I flunked the medical. I was like almost offered, I was basically offered a job at the city of New York in their tech department. And then they had a hiring freeze. It was just endless that, and so I had interviewed for a job with The Economist. And then nothing. I'd heard nothing for 6 weeks, and I thought, well, there was another job I almost got, or like maybe didn't almost get. Right? I gotten called back for a second interview, but then just nothing.
I
Total
think
radio
that's an
silence.
almost.
Yeah. So anyway, I get a phone call. I'm at home, and I've actually been up all night playing video games because I'm really depressed. And this British dude on the phone says, "Hello, this is Anthony Gottlieb from The Economist." And I was like, "Oh, hi. How are you?" Didn't really know what to say. And he said, "Well, fine. Actually, I'm calling to offer you the job." And I was like, "I'll take it." And he's like a very reserved British guy, so he was a little taken aback. Oh, well, splendid. But I was, we were going to offer you, we are going to pay you, $40,000 a year. I was like, "You're going to pay me?" And then I kind of realized I was sounding like an idiot. And then I calmed down a little bit. But I got off the phone and I called the guy who had taken me to that show. And I said, I got a job. And I started crying. And I'm not like a cry-y person. The other time I have started crying in happiness was at my wedding. That's it. The 2 days. I mean, it was just, and I say this all to say, like, this is an intensely emotional experience and it's not fun, right? Not all failure is just like cheerful, happy failure. Also, however, if I hadn't gotten to that point, as I think I mentioned, I had $100,000 in student loans. I was in New York City, which is a phenomenally expensive place to live. I don't think I could have taken a job that paid $40,000 a year. I wouldn't have brought myself to do it. I would have thought I'd love to, but I can't do the money. Right. And it was having gotten to the point where I was truly desperate. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, it is some money, which is much better than none. I have added it up and $40,000 is larger than zero. Right? Like, we're going to take that job. And it worked out great. I mean, it's been hard. Journalism is a collapsing industry. There's a lot of different hard things along the way. But it was great. It's been a great journey. I've had a lot of amazing opportunities. And if I have any regrets, it's just that I didn't do more with them. But I don't regret ever And like a lot of my classmates make more money than I do. Um, but I certainly, for one thing, do better than I ever thought I would, because I thought like $40,000 a year might well be the cap. Um, but also, like, I look at them and I don't want their lives. And I think it's useful to have made a decision like that, because a lot of people in my position begrudge the bankers and so forth who make these fantastic sums of money. And I won't try to kind of justify it in some metaphysical terms, but I don't begrudge them the money. They did something I didn't want to do for a long time and mortgaged kind of 20 years of their life to getting to the position where they're just raking in a bunch of money. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to do something I cared about. And, those are different. And I'm not saying that like they are somehow worse people than me or whatever. Like they just made a different trade-off than I did, and it's a valid trade-off. But they made the deal. They got what they put into the deal, but a lot of people made that deal and then didn't get it. They spent 2 years as an investment banking analyst and then had to leave because there wasn't a path upwards for them. And so I don't begrudge the people who are making more than me or have something different and better than me, because every time I'm tempted to feel sorry for myself in any way, I just think like, what, life isn't what you expected. I bet a lot of steel miners, steel workers in Pennsylvania feel the same way, and your life is a lot better than like being on having to go on disability because you really can't figure out anything else that uses your skill set anywhere near within 100 miles of where you live. And so, at the end of the day, it's I'm pretty lucky, and I appreciate that, but I also think like we need to understand the role that sometimes feeling pretty unlucky plays in getting to that spot, and people aren't good at it because it's so raw. I just read a wonderful essay from 2014 by a woman at NPR who was actually just talking about fat shaming. And I've never been heavy enough to be fat shamed, so I can't speak to that particular thing. But she just talks about the way that everyone has what she calls a red handle. It's this thing that you can pull and they will just feel terrible, right? And everyone does. Everyone has those raw places that never really heal over all the way, and that's something else. Is that like you guys should know now, right? There are some wounds that are never going to quite be what the scars will never go away, and that's okay too.
That's a little scary, but it'll be okay.
Well, I mean, yeah, it will. Like at the end of it is a little scary, but it's also that like in a lot of ways those they will end up being your 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 scars of honor, your battle wounds for having gone into life and gotten into the fray. And frankly, the more you really get into the fray, the more you really push yourself to the edge of your capabilities, the more scars you're going to have, because it's going to mean you tried to do something you really wanted, and then sometimes you just didn't get it.
No risk life sounds boring and stagnant. And not only in terms of jobs, but everything about life. Not taking any chance ever does not seem like it gives you a good output. I mean, you kind of talk about this in the book. You say that the opposite of failure is nothing. You write, quote, "The riskiest strategy is to try to work yourself into a position where you can't fail. The failure, when it comes, tends to be catastrophic, in part because you haven't prepared for it," end quote.
Yeah.
Can you, yeah, I mean, that just sums up kind of.
Yeah, I mean, you think about that with a lot of the old auto worker jobs, right? And those jobs were better jobs than any other jobs in the United States for people at that skill level. You get out of high school and get on a track to be making more than a lot of professionals. And this is all to the economy of the 70s, when a lot of things were very different in the income structure. So I'm not trying to say that it was outrageous they didn't earn it. Like that's a separate debate for another time, but they were amazing jobs, right? For the people who were getting them, that was a kind of opportunity that no one else in the country had. There were a couple other industries where that was true, but not a lot. And when they started to go away, it was a total disaster because there was nothing to replace it. There was nothing that really, in some ways, could replace a job where not only did you get paid way more than other people with comparable skill sets, but if the company couldn't use you, they just put you basically in you would just show up and not work. Right? They would do temporary layoffs at plants, but if they had like just a surplus labor pool, they just had a bunch of people who would just kind of show up and collect a check and not be doing anything at any given time. Something like the rubber rooms of the legendary of the New York City school system, where they park teachers that are hard to fire. But these weren't people who'd done anything wrong. They were people who just the company didn't need. And it was a sweet gig. But the problem with that is, like, what do you do if that goes away, as it ultimately did, because it was unsustainable? And, a perfectly risk-free life tends to be a perfectly unsustainable life. And the problem is, like, now people can manage to live and die within that, right? It's not that you necessarily personally are always going to get the short end of the stick, but you're at a catastrophic risk, because if it goes awry, there's no way to get back to where you were, and people tend to live up to their incomes. It's just a kind of natural thing. But I'll also say that even for like government workers, right? I know a fair number of them. I live in Washington, D.C. They spend a lot of time complaining about how they have colleagues who have just kind of prematurely retired 20 years early, or complaining that the bureaucratic procedures are ridiculous, and they always sound absolutely ridiculous. I'm very sympathetic that it's like just totally crazily impossible to get anything done, and so forth. They do have job security, but they pay for that job security. And that is, again, like, there's the idea that we can get rid of that trade-off, that there can be this great job security and then there's no downside to that, I think is just very unrealistic.
Definitely, I definitely agree with that. Well, so the book and just failure in general as a concept, everyone as a human fails. So there's this like large
Yep.
audience. But it seems like what you really want people to get out of it, your main point is that failure can be productive only if we really learn how to fail well.
Yes.
So what is the difference between a good failure and a bad failure?
So a bad failure is where so I think of something like the criminal justice system is one of the best examples of bad failure in the country, right? Is that by the time someone gets into the criminal justice system, not always the case, but it is usually the case that many, many, many people have failed that person before they got there. And then that person has failed a bunch too, right? That they have had parents who were not reliable, schools that were bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, neighborhoods that were not safe, all of it. And that wasn't their fault because they were little kids when that started, right? But also that it is also true that the kids who grow up in that environment, we often talk as if those environments do promote crime, and that's bad, and we should try to not have environments that promote crime. But it's also true that, like, most people who grow up in those environments don't become criminals. And we really forget that. We talk as if they're like amoebas. They're not. They're human beings. They have agency. They chose. They chose badly. But then you get to how the criminal justice system handles that, and you look at how it handles juvenile to adult, the juvenile to adult transition, right? Is that often very little happens until until suddenly one day you turn 18, you're an adult, you get a record for a couple of arrests, and then it escalates, as crime often does, and then someone gets hurt badly or dies, and then you go to jail for a really long time. Right? It's what the late great public policy expert who specialized in crime and drug policy, but who was just a wonderful mind about so many things. I wish he were still here with us for so many reasons, including so that I could recommend you have him on your podcast. But the way he put it was he described, like, how, for example, the probation system worked, right? Where it was, you would get put on probation and then you would violate your probation, and then your probation officer would tell you, don't do that, and I'm going to sanction you. But the paperwork was really onerous, and they would feel bad about, it was only one violation, and so they'd give you a second chance, and then they give you a third chance, and then one day they would just decide that you clearly were not going to get with the program, and they were just going to have to revoke your probation, and then you would go to jail for 5 years. Or 10 years, or however long you had your sentence deferred for. And the way he describes it is like nothing, bam, 5 years in jail, right? And if you think about it, this is a terrible way to fail. There was no feedback. And look, and you should think that it shouldn't be required. But look, again, if you have not grown up, if you think about the way the environment that a lot of the people come out of, first of all, often really high number of drug and alcohol problems, which just impairs your ability to make good judgments. Regardless of your opinion about drug policy or alcohol policy, I am in favor of very liberal policy on both. We should all recognize that when you are really high or really drunk, you're not in your best decision making. You're apt to be putting on your bad idea jeans and going out to do something you really shouldn't. And so if you just think about people who've grown up without what researchers call an internal locus of control, which is a feeling that middle class parents spend a lot of time drilling into middle class kids, right? Which is like, if you do X, Y happens. That's just a reliable thing. You follow the rules, and the system will spit out a certain range of acceptable results, right? If you do all of your homework and you turn things in, you will get decent grades, and then you will go to a decent college, and then you will get a decent job. And like, that's all totally within your control. And that's just something that naturally happens if you follow the rules, right? That is a middle class upbringing. That is not what an upbringing in a poor neighborhood with parents who may themselves have drug and alcohol problems or other problems, mental health problems that are untreated, but also just, the economic precarity of these neighborhoods. That's not a message you get. And then they get into the criminal justice system, both as juveniles and adults, and the message that the system sends them, right? When what happened to you is the same, you do the same thing 5 times, and 4 out of the 5 times, nothing happens except that your probation officer yells at you. And then the 5th time you go to prison for 5 years. You don't take the message that like, I caused that to happen. You take the message of like, I guess she hates me and had a bad day, right? Is that consistency is of being able to do something and then get a known result from doing that thing is really prevalent in middle class lives, and really not prevalent because of the way that the system is set up. And that in turn impedes any ability to learn from the experience, right? They know that they don't like prison, but it doesn't set up a way that's internally felt of like, I have a framework. And especially because once you have a prison record, it's almost impossible to get back onto that middle class track of like having a normal job. And one of the great tragedies to me is that while I love the fact that there are so many programs getting felons mainstreamed, clean into society. And we need every one of those people is doing God's work, and we need more of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But too many of the success stories that I read are like, now I am working in this program to help felons get back into the mainstream, which is great. I'm glad you're doing that. I would love to read. And now I'm a certified public accountant. You can't do that because of occupational licensing, and that's one aspect of the problem, but it's hard to get employers to look at the resumes. There's a whole bunch of... So we want to knock that system down. It's not going to work in every case, but we could be doing a lot more to create an environment where the consequences for doing something wrong are smaller but predictable, instead of so large that we don't want to apply them consistently.
Yeah, another institution, I guess, that kind of teaches about failure in the wrong way and doesn't teach the consequences, but also kind of the attitudes towards failure that are productive. So they don't teach you how to fail well is schools.
Yes.
So especially my school, I don't know every school, I would say, just the structure of schools in America, in a lot of places. So I guess the idea first that kind of is an introduction to this is the idea that to succeed in life, you have to have talent and you have to have natural skills. So can you tell us why that's incorrect, but also explain what the difference is between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset and how that kind of sets you up to deal with failure?
Yeah. So I will say that the research on which this is based has not replicated as well as I would have liked, sadly. So since the book, I'm slightly pulling back from this, but I still think that the broad lessons are really applicable. First of all, talent matters, and we all know that, right? If you are the best kid at math in your class, you don't really think that the worst kid at math in your class is very likely to be able to get the same score on a math test as you, right? And then those differences appeared early and they're pretty consistent. I was the best writer in my class when I was a little kid, and I was the best writer in my class when I was in high school, and I was the best writer in my class when I graduated from college, right? Or certainly among the best. The competition gets tougher at each level. I'm definitely not the best writer in journalism. But talent does exist, but it's not enough because I've watched so many talented writers wreck themselves. And what they
Mm-hmm.
do is they get to thinking that the only thing that matters is talent, and it's not. They get to thinking that everything they write is a referendum on what they were born with instead of what they've developed. And that's a really easy message to get out of school, right? Because for the people who do really well at school, it generally is pretty easy. And it generally is, especially if you're one of those kids at the very top, which if you are sorted into a kind of academic discipline, right? If you're sorted into something that's very math heavy, or you're sorted into something that's very writing heavy, you were probably always close to the top of your class at that. And it sends the message that what really matters is just how easy you find it. And that'll do. Certainly through high school for a lot of people, through college for a lot of people, even maybe part of grad school for a lot of people, right? But there just comes a point where if you wanna strive for excellence, you get to a point where that isn't going to cut it because everyone else also found it easy. And the problem at that point is that actually where what really separates the sheep from the lambs is doing the stuff that's hard. And that's different for everyone. And I think of an example that I gave. I gave a talk on this book actually a few weeks ago to an organization, and I was talking about just career wise. Most of us, and I think probably most people, most kids your age too, have had this experience of like, I did the part that I'm good at instead of the part that I'm bad at because I'm bad at the part and I don't like feeling bad at things, and it makes me anxious and it's unpleasant and it's not nearly as fun as just effortlessly doing this thing I'm really good at. And so I just kind of give short shrift to those parts and concentrate on the stuff where I know I'm going to shine. And for me, this is, for example, like making phone calls, which I hate. I hate calling people. And, you know, about 6 months ago, I got a call from a banker who I won't name, but who said it was funny. Like, it was like weird phone tag for a couple of days. Finally, at like 8 o'clock in the morning, this person reached me and said, and I was prepared because I had written something about their organization. I was prepared to get yelled at.
Uh-huh.
And I had prepared all of my counter arguments, and so I was totally floored and unprepared for being told, "Oh, I just wanted to call because I like your stuff." I was like, "What? Why are you chasing me to tell me that? That's really weird. Thank you, but this is very strange. I was not prepared for that. I was prepared to be yelled at. I had a lot of good arguments. Do you want to hear them?" But so anyway, when I went to New York, where the banks are, about 3 months later, and I thought I should call this person and try to sit down with them. And then I was like, oh, but that's going to be embarrassing. And like, I didn't come off very well on the phone because I was really kind of honestly sleepy. I'd had a late night the night before. I forget. I think it was some speech or some election thing, or I don't really remember what the details were, but I'd been up late working the night before. And like, also this person doesn't want to hear from me. And for like, just to let you know, I'm in my 40s and I do this for a living. It never stops. This part never. If you are anxious about doing things, you really have to. You will never get quite as comfortable as the people who are just like, yeah, that's fine. But I just thought to myself, like, you are not in high school. This is not study hall, and like, if this person rejects you, you will never see them again. They're not going to run into them. Like, it's not. They're not going to be at the prom. And so I just made the phone call and it was totally fine. And I had a very good sit down interview. And that is, for me, the hard part of my job is cold calling people who I know aren't necessarily going to be super interested in talking to me. And for other people, for every person, it's a different thing. There's some people who are totally fine with the cold calling and the writing. The writing, oh, what do I hear from my friends who don't work in journalism? Oh God, I can't, I have to write something. What am I going to do? I'm like, writing. I can just do that all day. Right. So it's, but excellence for anyone is going to be about sometimes identifying the stuff that you're really just never going to be good at and figuring out how to get someone else to do it, right? If you're really bad on the phone, you should not be like, I am going to now try to go into fundraising for a living. That would be a bad career choice for you. You're going to spend a lot of time on the phone. But for a lot of jobs, for any job, it's going to be that I'm going to have to figure out how to get at least decent at writing. I'm going to have to figure out how to get at least decent about calling strangers, even though I don't want to. I'm going to figure out how to be decent about asking for feedback from my bosses, which is something that I think a lot of smart kids especially struggle with, because feedback just comes effortlessly when you're in school. And then you get out in the real world and like no one has time. They're all doing their own stuff, and they will give you, your bosses and so forth will give you feedback, but often you're going and saying like, hey, is there something negative here that I should know about myself? No one is really excited about finding that out, right? It's so all of that stuff, how could I have done this better? How am I not pleasing you? How could I be better in the organization? Those questions are the hard questions to ask. And it's often, I think, why you see now, if you look at kind of some of the discourse around younger workers and so forth, a lot of it is a way of like organizing to get positive feedback, but not a lot of ways of organizing to get the negative feedback they need to develop. And that's because it's really hard, and I'm terrible at it, and certainly was not doing it in my 20s. So don't take this as like, those young people, they're so different from me. No, we were not, like, we didn't ask for it either, but it's a really valuable skill to learn, to go and be like, hey, I feel like I actually could have done this better. Can you help me? Can you just
Mhm.
tell me like two things that you feel like I could really have done better here, and concrete ways that I could get better at that? Um, that's a kind of good failure. But I think, to go back to the criminal justice, but I think this is just a good example in so many ways. Is also, institutions that should create an environment where people are failing well, where, first of all, so what are the principles of really failing well? One of them is just to minimize the cost of the potential failure. It is that um, you have to lower the stakes for people so that it's not like my job is on the line. Sometimes people's jobs are on the line at the very high levels, right? And that's fair. If you are the guy who they've brought in, the hot shot to like turn around their sales team, and you don't turn it around, okay, well, your job was on the line there, but also you make a ton of money and you've been doing this for a long time. But for most people, most of the time, that shouldn't be the stakes. The stakes should be lower. And in part, that's going to be about managing how much damage they can do, right? Companies, organizations, people should be taking risks. You should not be betting the farm on anything unless you are in existential danger. And it is literally, the company is going to go out of business in 2 weeks. We might as well try this because like there's no downside at this point, right? And there are situations like that. Also, still do not do anything illegal in that situation, to be clear, but short of that, or things that are going to end up like, making you go bankrupt when you wouldn't have had to. But other than that, yeah, sure, go for broke. Bring out your line of meat flavored toothpaste and see if there's a market. Like,
Oh,
that's all you've got left. Go for it.
I don't think I
Um,
would buy it.
I don't think I would buy it either. But um, the point is, that organizations, and I think about this with some of the cancel culture stuff, especially with the young people. People like the girl at the AP who was just fired. People like Hemal Javeri, who was fired a few months ago from USA Today. Um, my personal preference is like, honestly, that I think that media organizations should just have a policy that no one's allowed to be on Twitter. I've been writing this, by the way. This is not like some big revelations. I've now written like 3 columns on like, just get everyone off Twitter. It would be better. Right. And why, but it's actually, but I think this illustrates like, why should you get people off Twitter? Okay. So for one thing, people are taking huge reputational risks with big enterprises. right? With now, I don't think that anything should have been done about this girl's tweets in college, which had been an issue with the AP case, it looked like, possibly, although the AP says that was not what caused this. So we should be clear about that. But early reporting had suggested that perhaps things she had written in college about the Palestinian question and other things were contributing to this. That, I think, is just obviously, let the dead past bury its dead. But going forward, right, you have people who are, the fact is, if you work for the AP, if you work for the Washington Post, maybe it's not fair. You know what? You got one of the very rare jobs in journalism, and life is not always fair. Every job comes with its trade-offs. And this is one. And I think about this a lot. Is like, every time I write something in public, like it or not, I'm putting the reputation of the Washington Post online because they pay me. And therefore, I have to think about, is this something that I wouldn't want that my editors would be happy to explain for me, right? And so you should think about, and the problem is that there's no upside to the organization of these. It's actually astonishing how little traffic comes in from Twitter compared to like Facebook or Google News. It's entirely about kind of catching the attention of other journalists. So it's a kind of a career brand management operation for the journalists. But even the journalists get caught up in these social dynamics and they misread cues, which is very easy to do online. And they do themselves no good. So I don't actually think this would be like a harm to them if organizations told the people to get off Twitter. But it's partly, instead, what you have is these very vague social media. Don't do anything that would cast your publication in ill repute. Well, I might have a different idea about what that is than what the managers of the publication do. And when that happens, right, suddenly I'm going to get in trouble because we have a different point of view on that, right? You've got a policy that's basically impossible to follow. And I understand how these policies evolved, but these policies had initially evolved for journalists who had been in the business for like 20 years and had a pretty good sense of what would cause trouble if they said it and what wouldn't. And now you've got a bunch of young kids coming in who obviously don't, because they haven't been in the business 20 years. There's no reason to expect them to, but you're creating reputational problems for your brand. There's no upside for you. There's a huge career risk for them that's much larger than the risk to you. And it's a bad way of handling failure. And a much clearer way is like, if we can't manage this risk, which clearly no one can, then the way we manage it is to tell people to get off, because it's not a manageable risk. We weren't thinking about failure properly. We're allowing people to take unmanageable, low upside risks. And that's exactly the kind of failure you shouldn't be taking.
And especially with the rise of cancel culture and all of this stuff where it's changing so rapidly what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, regardless of how I feel about that. And so I don't know. I always think back to The Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And I feel like a lot of this connects, like the attitudes towards failure, the way they're taught in schools and the way as a society we have, the attitude we have towards failure, that kind of reflects exactly what's happening with people getting fired and all of that. So do you think there's a connection? And if so, what is that connection?
Well, I mean, I think in a way, I wrote in the book that if you look I feel so bad for your generation, because my generation had so much more freedom than yours does. And partly that was just a function of being in a small birth cohort, so it was easier to get into college. And I know you guys had the biggest problem because people deferred for a year.
R.I.P. college admissions.
Yeah. I feel bad for you, although I know you're going to a great school, so
thank you.
I'm going to be honest, I don't feel too bad for you. but that you guys spend so much more time. When I was in school, you started thinking about, and I went to a private school where the whole deal of you paid this tuition so that your private school would get your kid into like a really good college, right? That was the quid pro quo. But not even in that school, we really started thinking about college with, in high school, your grades mattered more than in middle school, they just didn't. In high school, they mattered somewhat. Your last 2 years mattered a lot more than. But like, I got into an Ivy League school with a 2.7 GPA, and that just wouldn't be feasible now. I wrote really good
What?
essays, I had good test scores, but yeah. And also I went to a private school that didn't have, like, we didn't have higher than 4 GPAs. That wasn't a thing at my school. And the grading was somewhat harder than it is at public school. Not no offense or whatever, but we just had our GPA distribution didn't look the same as now, where like, the valedictorians got like a 5.6 or something
Or
crazy. That
there
wasn't.
are, I think this year we have 110 valedictorians at my school because everyone who has above a 4.0 gets to be the
Yeah,
valedictorian.
that was not possible. First of all, my high school class only had 94 people in it, but also it just wasn't possible in my school. I think there was like one kid who had a 4.0 average. There were lots of people who would have been in like the high threes, but it was a different place, and the grade scale was different. But yeah, even with all those caveats, a 2.7 was not thought of as a good GPA. But they would take risks on kids who were interesting, and they don't. And I think that's actually a really huge metaphor for a lot of stuff in our society, is that you guys have been. And also, like, our personal essays were not these endless catalogs of trauma, which you're now trained
I
to.
refused to do that.
Yeah,
People were like, you have perfect stories, you can do it. And I was like, no.
yeah, and I think it's really unhealthy. Is like to, I mean, what is the message that we're sending kids? First of all, is to, um, first of all, I think in many ways to like overshare, right? Some things are private, and not everyone. Now, if people want to talk about that, that's fine. I'm not saying that people are different about how open they are about stuff, but like making it mandatory is weird, right? It's like it's college admissions, not therapy. And but also just that you guys are just raised to like groom your resumes from a very young age, and not just with the grades, not just with the AP classes or the international baccalaureate or all the rest of it, but the community service and the, people starting fake charities and all, like, right, or not fake charities exactly, but mom and dad are starting a charity that their kid can run in order to put it on the application, right? That's crazy. It's creating this whole weird fake persona of a 37-year-old very successful nonprofit executive in order to get into college. And the kids my age, like, we worked pretty hard. I was at school from 7. I was either on a train or at school from a little before 7 in the morning to a little after 7 at night, because my school was an hour from my house.
Oh, wow.
And I was on athletics because athletics were kind of mandatory at my school. Not exactly mandatory, but basically no one, socially, there was a huge amount of pressure to be on teams. Um, but even with all of that, we played a lot more than you guys do, I feel like. We just had more downtime and a lot less pressure and a lot more feeling that, like, you would obviously be very upset if you didn't get into a good college, but it wasn't like, well, I guess your life is blighted and now you're going to be a janitor. Um, and actually, even I think my parents had less sense that to be a janitor was to have your life blighted. They were both the first generation of their families to go to college. Lots of my relatives didn't, and had perfectly happy, good lives. And so, as we've pulled away from that, I think for kids in the middle class and up, it's this incredibly low. You just have very little room for error. And then on the other hand, poor kids, it's not like they can't make it through all these hoops, but they have to be like, I don't think it's possible for a gymnast to get a perfect 10 anymore, but it used to be. So, like Nadia Comaneci or Mary Lou Retton, they have to score a perfect 10. There is zero room for error. And those two different ways of approaching childhood are both really toxic and bad. And what we need is more in between. But I think one thing that cancel culture represents is that it is that kind of punitiveness, except for the upper middle class. One mistake that you didn't even understand. There was a great line from John Scalzi, who's a science fiction writer, who once said, poor is wrecking your life with decisions you didn't even know you made at 14. Right? And there's so much truth in that. And now
Yeah.
this is a lot of what cancel culture is like people who genuinely did not understand that, I've been writing recently about the story of Donald McNeil at the New York Times, who was eventually forced out over having used the N word, to be clear, not as a slur, but as an example, as like it's the what they call the use mention distinction. Okay. So I will say, I have never said that word out loud. I no, that's not true. Um, I I heard a kid who was herself black say it at school when I was in, I want to say second grade. So I was, because I skipped a grade, I was 6 years old. And I
Wow.
came home and I said it, and my mother slapped me so hard my teeth rattled, and I never said it again. I don't think I could physically say it. And I've had conversations with John McWhorter about this, who thinks that white people should be able to use it. John McWhorter is, for people who do not know, black himself. He's a linguistics professor. His linguistics stuff is amazing, and I'm just a huge John McWhorter linguistics fangirl. But I actually talked to him about this once, and I was like, John, I get what you're saying, and maybe you're right, but even if, you know, forget the kind of social sanction for it, I don't think I could get the word out if I tried. I think I'd like my throat would close. And I'm fine with that. And I think that having a fight over it, especially for white people to be leading that fight, is just dumb, right? Like, why do you want to say the word so bad? What is it about? Is the beautiful sound of the word? Just leave it to other people.
Yeah.
It's just, I have no interest in fighting that particular fight. So I'm not defending what he did exactly, but he is also in his late 60s. And it is certainly clear that he came up in a time where to use it as an example, not to ever direct it at someone, was just as taboo as it is now, but to use it as an example was not taboo. Um, and so I don't think he understood. Maybe he did, right? Maybe he was just being a jerk. It's possible. I don't know him, right? I've never met him. I've never spoken to him.
Hmm.
But I think that there is reason to think that he just genuinely didn't understand that what he had done was, for people 20 years younger than him and younger, pretty much the taboo equivalent of just having shouted it at someone in a slur, like derogatorily. And I don't think he got that. And not understanding that, I'm inclined to, or at least with the possibility that he didn't, I'm inclined to cut people grace for doing things that they didn't understand were going to generate the reaction that they genuinely didn't. Not that they were trolling and then they're, the people who are, they aren't sad they did it, but they're awful sorry they got caught. But the
Hmm.
people who genuinely just do something, but the mores have changed and they didn't get the memo, which is going to happen. One price of cultural change is that some people won't get the memo. And I know that there is a kind of a theory that the way to make it happen faster is to be as punitive as possible on those people. And I really think that, for a bunch of reasons, it's not true. I think just empirically, it doesn't seem like cancel culture has really tamped down and like happily increased the, America's changing racial reckoning. But I also just think, as a kind of manner of building society we want to live in, because you don't know, right? You might someday be the person who didn't get the memo. Because, like, I hate to break it to all the 25-year-olds who are real sure that they're always going to be on the same page as the 25-year-olds, but like, we all thought the same thing when we were 25, and no. There will come a day when you will not have gotten the memo, and you should try to build a society that you'll want to live in then, and not the society that you'll want to live in now when you're writing the memo.
I think also you can already see it. A lot of professors, especially who defend students who kind of push the cancel culture stuff and try to cancel people around them, will defend those students and then they will later get canceled for
Yep.
something that they defended. Well, not what they defended, but they get canceled and have to react to the same force that they were defending earlier, and then they're out of a job. Oh no. I don't know. It seems pretty clear that there there are some very negative consequences that I do not think are necessarily proportional, or I guess, like, yeah. to
Yeah, I think that you creating a climate of fear. I mean, it's effective at a certain level, right? I guess Stalin didn't hear very many negative things about himself, but it's disastrous in the same way that it was for Stalin, because what you want, right? What you want is either a genuine change of mind, or that at least people will publicly only do the things that you consider acceptable, right? And that everything else is going to go along as it would, and that's not how it works. Is that if a small group of people is the final arbiter, and no one else even knows if they got the memo or if there was a memo, right? Or if there will be a new memo tomorrow and they will be retroactively judged for having failed to anticipate the memo, right? You get a lot of other toxic, weird behavior. And if anyone hasn't seen The Death of Stalin, um, there's a really funny, the opening scene where Stalin has enjoyed a radio broadcast and then wants to hear it again, but no one made a recording of it. And so they have to just try to do the entire thing again, exactly as they did before. That this is, you don't want to create that environment, even when you're trying to do something really good, right? Even when it's not, and this is something that really bothers me about the way we talk about cancel culture, is that to oppose cancellation for this stuff and to say, yeah, I think you should argue it out instead, which is really tiring. And the column that I just filed is actually in a lot about the ways in which during the pandemic people deployed follow the science as a way to say, I don't want to argue about it. But they weren't saying follow the science because science is contestable. What they were saying was, you have to defer to this expert who I consider to be the final authority here. And it was unhealthy, and it caused us to make a bunch of mistakes.
I think
And
also the internet and doing things over the internet, even if you're trying to talk it out, it just doesn't work the same at all.
yes and no. Look, this is the thing that one point that I made in the column, among many, was I get it. I was tired. I favored. I was a pretty hardliner on yeah, we should lock stuff down and we should all wear masks and all the rest of it. And I'm sure I did this at least once or twice, and I really regret it. But I tried not to. Try not to do the well, experts say, and therefore I'm not arguing about this anymore. But I know I did it at least a few times because I ran out of patience. Because a lot of the arguments I was dealing with were disingenuous. I didn't want to have the argument anymore. I just wanted the fight to be over. I was sick of it. And I remember one person who I really like, actually, but who was extremely persistent and kept messaging me. And finally I was like, I don't want to have this fight. It's my weekend. I like you, but stop. Because I'm about to lose my temper. In fact, I had lost my temper. And so I get it. I get why people just wanted to stop the argument rather than fight with arguments that were often not very good. But some of the arguments were very good. And if you shut it all down, you miss the ones that were very good. And I think now looking back, lockdowns and masks, well, I still think they were on net the right policy, were not as effective as I hoped. As policy mandates, they were even less effective than they were as personal precautions. And we should reckon with that. And we should have reckoned with it better at the time. And we didn't, because so many people were just in this kind of kneel before Zod mode where an expert has spoken. How dare you, mere mortal, question the experts? Well, I think the revision of the lab leak hypothesis shows right now why that is a problem, is that everyone was treating the possibility of a lab leak in Wuhan as if it were the equivalent of believing the Freemasons were poisoning the wells. When in fact, I mean, look, you've got a bat virus whose nearest known relative has turned up at the virological institute that happens to be 10 miles, or 10 kilometers or whatever, from 5 miles from what appears to be the epicenter of the epidemic. You have no animal chain of transmission. And they happen to have the sample of the nearest known relative, which is from a cave that's 800 miles from where the epidemic started. Look, maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it's probable that it's a coincidence. I'm not a virologist. I'm not vouching for this theory, but dismissing that as this is just sheer nuttery was kind of itself crazy. And a lot of people did it. And I just think it tells you, yes, there are reasons that people don't want to have the same bad argument over and over again because it's incredibly frustrating and irritating, and you would just like it to stop. So I get it. And yet, and yet it is still, for all of that, refusing to have the argument, trying to shun people who insist on having the argument. It's a bad approach. Like, sometimes you just have to be like, I've definitely had people who I'm like, this person I'm not having a productive argument with, I'm having this person flood me with troll memes about, masks or whatever that aren't true. I'm not going to keep trying to argue with the troll memes because, I don't speak meme. But the kind of blanket bans on no one can discuss this, they are bad. And I think that even when the cause is super important, even when I agree with it 100%, as I do, in fact, with a lot of the things that people who are pursuing cancel culture are going after, it doesn't matter because it's just a bad way to try to get to the end you want, which is not a more frightened society in which people are terrified to say anything that might sound even vaguely adjacent to this bad thing, but a society in which people actually are better to each other and care more about each other and know more about each other than they do now.
Thank you, Megan. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Oh gosh, so many things. I was like pretty lefty when I was younger. So a lot of things on that front. But I think the thing that I believed most, this is going to sound bad and it's not. I think I expected people to behave more like rational value maximizers than they do. Um, they do more than people on the left think, I think, especially in the context of things like markets, which encourage very strongly people to act like rational value maximizers. Um, but I also think that people value more things than I understood at a younger age. Um, and so I think that the economy is much more complicated, but also just I think of things like it's really funny actually watching everyone just rediscover like free love and polycules and all the rest of it, which is all stuff that was in currency when I was in college. And everyone's like, we just discovered this because we're young and hot. Like, no, you're really not. You're not. None of it is new. But I mean, no, they are young and hot, to be clear. It's not new. They haven't discovered anything, but they are very young and hot, I grant. And, I sort of want to associate myself with Nora Ephron's remarks. She was like, if you are like 25, I want you to go out right now. I want you to put on a bikini and I don't want you to take it off until you're 35. It's totally true. Like, enjoy the fact that you are about as hot as you're ever going to be. And like, and this is actually like going to be my parting message to girls, especially. It's like, stop obsessing about the fact that you don't look like, whatever person you think is the most beautiful person in the world. Because like, you're going to look back in 20 years and you'll be like, man, I was so beautiful. And I'm so sad that I didn't just like realize I was beautiful and walk around thinking like, I am hot. I am awesome and beautiful. Just like, you're all awesome and beautiful. And you should just totally actually walk around believing that because it's true. So back to regularly scheduled programming, is that I think that like, I thought people in relationships that they should be more kind of transactional than they are. That they're, this kind of very romantic idea of like, you don't get married because it's just a piece of paper and what really matters is how we feel about it. And all of those sorts of ideas, they are very appropriate to the age of 18 or whatever. But I don't think they're true. I think that in fact, the pieces of paper really matter. The mere act of committing yourself in front of another person, in front of not just one other person, but in front of huge groups of family and friends, and making that commitment. I did not understand this in any way. Right before I got married, Daniel Gilbert, I interviewed Daniel Gilbert, who is the psychologist who argues basically, among other things, like your level of happiness is a lot genetic and kind of temperamental. But there's actually good news in that, which is that whatever happens to you, you're probably going to find a way to basically be about as happy as you are now. There are some few exceptions, but in general, that is the case. And so he had a really interesting, he said he was talking to someone who came up to him after a book talk who said, so what you're saying is that it isn't that you get married to seal the love you feel for a person. It's that the act of getting married causes you to love the other person, because now you're committed, and the best way to be committed to that person, like you will be happiest if you love that person. And so you find reasons to love them. And he thought, wow, that's exactly right. And he went home and proposed to his girlfriend he'd been living with for a long time. And he said to me, and he was right. I proposed and we got married, and now I love her even more than I did before.
Wow.
And it's really true in a way that's just super hard to explain if you're not married.
Yep.
I got married like 6 months after I got married. I was watching some really terrible Claudette Colbert film about it was a woman and her husband are in Asia when the Japanese invade, and they get interned in separate camps. And I watched their parting, and like before it would have been just a kind of sweet romantic scene, and I thought, oh my God, that would kill me. I would just be like lying on the ground and screaming.
Oof.
Right? There is just no and I had not understood the intensity of the love I would feel for my husband until after I married him. And even though I'd been with him for several years before, I loved him a lot. It's just, and so that is the thing that I really didn't understand when I was young, that the mere act of committing irretrievably to things, even if those things, and my husband is of course perfect, but at a young age, what you want is you think your job is to find the perfect thing, the perfect job, the perfect person, and it's all going to be perfect, and you will know that it is perfect. And what I now understand is that actually a huge amount of happiness comes from being embedded in things that you didn't fully choose, because first of all, you can't ever fully choose. You don't know what it's going to be like when you've had it for 10 years, whether it's a house or a relationship or anything else. That as you get older, your friends will matter less and your relatives will matter more. That you will feel a hunger that you didn't even know for the people who just, knew grandma. And you can talk about grandma with them and all of that stuff that in fact are unchosen obligations, the things that were in no way selected for their perfect fitness to us, are the most perfect things we have in our lives. I didn't understand that at all, and it skewed a lot of my thinking about where I wanted to go and what I wanted my life to be.
Thank you so much for imparting your wisdom and for being on my podcast. I had such a good time. Thank you so much.
I had a great time too. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank my guest once again for their time and insight. I would also like to thank everyone who listens, subscribes, and shares the Great Antidote podcast. If you would like to be on the podcast, or if you have a guest in mind, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@thecgo.org. Bye!